Why basketball requires the best athletes. Welcome back to Streetball Strategies.
We gonna do this one a little different. We gonna keep that bop. Rock it out, see. Rock it out, see.
So here in Michigan, it's the very beginning of spring, which means we've had about 5 months off of the court. So it's just the very beginning of getting back on the court and getting back into basketball shape. Because this happens every spring and it's such a difficult thing to do, getting back in basketball shape, every spring it makes me think about how basketball is, in my opinion, the most athletic sport. Now keep in mind, I don't really know much of anything about anything besides basketball, let alone other sports, let alone sports like cricket or rugby or even other American sports. Basketball is really the only thing I do. It's really the only thing I know and have a mastery of, other than being a student of physical and athletic movement in general. But to my understanding and in my opinion, here are the reasons why basketball is the most athletic sport. First of all, basketball players all do pretty much the same physical movements, as opposed to other sports where different positions require different movements and different skill sets. All basketball players pretty much have to do the same movements. Whereas, for example, like a third baseman has to have a different kind of skill set in terms of physical movement than like a right fielder, or a cornerback has to have a different physical moveset than like a linebacker. But in basketball, all players do all the same things pretty much. I mean, big guys who work down around the basket, they are a little more stationary and they have to do a little more physical contact and kind of wrestling while staying stationary and in place, whereas guards like me, we also have to encounter physical contact and wrestling, but we do it around the perimeter while we're moving, right? But for the most part, all basketball players, we all have to dribble and pass and move and jump and all of that stuff, whereas in other sports, playing different positions could mean that you do drastically different physical movements than your teammates. So all basketball players, because we do all the same moves and movements, we have to be very physical and very physically rounded in terms of our athleticism. Second is the jumping required in basketball. Now, other sports you may have to jump on occasion, but in basketball it's a requirement of the game, especially out here at the park, because when you're playing basketball, not only are you jumping, but you're jumping dozens of times within a 10 to 20 minute time frame, depending on how long a game would take out here at the park. And when you're jumping, you're not just jumping to, a small amount of your effort, like 50% of your effort. Every jump that you make dozens of times in that 10 or 20 minutes, you're jumping as hard and as high as you can every time with as much velocity as you can create every single time you jump dozens and dozens of times within that 10 to 20 minutes. That kind of jumping just isn't required with other kinds of sports. And think about it. What's more demanding of your body than having to jump as hard as you can dozens and dozens of times within a 10 to 20 minute time frame? Just think about the strain that puts on your body, the energy required to jump that hard, the impact when you hit the ground dozens and dozens of times over and over again. And doing that on concrete, how demanding is that of your body? Other sports just don't do that. Thirdly is defense, the defensive movement, the lateral movement that requires you to play defense. And that's half of the game. You spend half of the game playing defense. And that's why I always allude to the fact that playing defense is all about effort. It's all about energy. That's why for guys like me who are old has-been guys who have worn out bodies or just simply lazy players, defense is so hard. And because it's so physically hard to do is one of the reasons it should be so highly coveted and valued as a player. When you play hard defense all the time, you deserve all the respect in the world because it's really hard to do. Because again, think about it. How do you play defense? What do you do? Well, you have to be able to go from a neutral standing kind of position. You have to be able to go from that explode down into a defensive stance. And when you're in that defensive stance, so you have to hold that stance in order to be able to move while you're in it. Is there more of a difficult, demanding body position to hold than a deep, textbook defensive position? There may be some yoga poses that you could hold that would be more overall demanding on your body, but holding a yoga pose, you're completely static, you're not moving. In a defensive stance, you have to be able to move while you're in it. So you have to be able to explode into it, move while you're into it, accelerate, stop on a dime, change direction, explode out of it over and over and over again throughout a game, and doing so is half of the game of basketball. Marathon runners can run 26 miles in a running body position, but imagine if you had to do a marathon in a defensive position. If you had to move 26 miles laterally in a defensive position, imagine how much impact that would have on your body. In terms of general guidelines of how to train those specific basketball movements, my advice is always what it is when it comes to high intensity training, which is, number one, you want to warm up thoroughly. So you want to warm up as much as you possibly can, and when you think you've warmed up enough, warm up a little bit more. There's no such thing as being too warmed up, and in general, I'm not a person who is concerned with safety, but as a athlete, a has-been athlete who accidentally ran himself into the ground physically, I'm all about safety when it comes to high intensity training. And then when you're actually in the midst of your training, go ahead and train absolutely as hard as you can, but don't be thinking about consciously pushing yourself to your limits. That's just naturally going to happen. What you want to be thinking about, what you want to be having in the front of your mind, is your physical safety and trying to avoid injuries. So instead of thinking about pushing yourself as hard as you can, try to keep in mind what your body is doing, how it's moving, the contact it's having with the ground, your momentum, your balance. You want to have those things be at the front of your mind, because the more conscious you are of those things, the less likely you are to injure yourself. Injuries usually happen when you become sloppy because you're only thinking about and you're only concentrating on pushing yourself to your limits. And when you're training things that are such high intensity, what leads to injuries most often is that your body becomes fatigued, your mind then becomes fatigued because your body's fatigued, and you get sloppy in your movements, and thus injuries happen. So instead of focusing on pushing yourself to your limit, try to focus on the movement of your body, the contact with the ground, your balance, your momentum. The more you can keep those things in the front of your mind, the less likely you are to injure yourself. And if you're injured, you can't play, and if you can't play, what's the point? And then there's cool down, of course, and cool down is the exact opposite of warming up, except for, it's the same thing in terms of you can never cool down enough. So cool down properly, thoroughly, and then when you think you've cooled down enough, cool down some more. Lastly is rest. So in my experience, it's always better to have a little more rest, a little too much rest than not enough. So because you're training these things and there's such high intensity, and it's always better to have a little too much than not enough. So that's why basketball requires the best athletes and general guidelines on how to accomplish being one of those athletes. Again, I don't have much experience with other sports, especially international sports, but to my knowledge and in my opinion, basketball is the most athletic sport, and it's the fact that all basketball players have to do the same movements, and the jumping and the defensive movement, the lateral movement, that separates us from other athletes. So thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoy this video, if you like this video, hit that like button. And if you want me to do a more in-depth video of how to train those specific basketball movements, let me know down in the comments. And if you guys could hit that subscribe button, that would really help me out, and hit that notification bell so you're notified of future videos about basketball strategies and philosophy and how to use them in order to elevate your game. So thank you guys again, and I will see you guys next week.
Hey man, I'm standing on the top, respect the demand. They better hand it. They hit the pop like hands, it's so random. The way we pedal is go tandem. I'm a right big anthem, still I drop phantom. Send them jabs at me. Any problem I handle. If you wanna talk, we can chop it up like a sample. Throw it chip up the flow. Roulette, go gamble, man, I scramble. The words still is lit, no candle. They say